A CEO was used to making big decisions, the kind that shaped a multi-million-dollar company. But one night, a simple request caught his attention. An employee had asked to take home leftover food. Something felt off. Curious about this unusual request, he visited the restaurant to investigate. There, he met a hard-working black woman, someone who never complained, the kind of employee any company would be lucky to have. He decided to meet her, and as he learned about her life, he realized one thing: his company needed to change. Daniel Carter sat in his office, the glow of his computer screen casting a dim light across the otherwise dark room. The city skyline stretched beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, a sea of lights twinkling against the night sky. It was well past business hours, and most of the executive team had long since gone home, but Daniel was still here, going through his usual end-of-the-day routine, approving reports, reviewing financials, scanning over employee emails. Daniel Carter had read countless employee requests over the years: schedule adjustments, payroll clarifications, time-off requests. Most of them were routine, requiring nothing more than a quick approval or a simple redirection to HR. But tonight, as he sat alone in his sleek office on the top floor of Horizon Diner's corporate headquarters in downtown Atlanta, long after the last executive had left for the night, his eyes lingered on one particular request. It wasn't a complaint. It wasn't even a demand. It was simple, almost too simple. Would it be possible to take home any leftover meals after my shift? Daniel frowned, rolling his chair back slightly. Employees took leftovers all the time. It was an unspoken rule. Kitchen staff often asked managers in person or discreetly packed up food at the end of their shifts. It was common practice. So why did this employee feel the need to submit an official request? He glanced at the name attached to the message: Aaliyah Brown. He didn't recognize it. That wasn't surprising. He oversaw over 100 locations and thousands of employees. But something about this request stuck with him. There was a formality to it, a hesitation, like whoever wrote it wasn't just asking for convenience. They were asking because they needed it. He pulled up her employee profile. 27 years old, line cook, 3 years with the company, no recorded complaints, no disciplinary issues, always clocked in on time, often stayed late, never took sick days, no emergency contacts listed. That was odd. Most employees at least had a friend or family member on file. He leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers against the desk. Maybe she was just frugal. Maybe she didn't want to spend money on food if she didn't have to. A lot of employees were struggling, even in a company that prided itself on paying above minimum wage. But there was something about the way she asked. It didn't read like someone trying to save money. It read like someone trying to survive. Daniel exhaled, rubbing his temples. He wasn't the sentimental type. He had built his way up from the ground, from a childhood in a working-class neighborhood to sitting at the helm of one of the most successful restaurant chains in the Southeast. His job was to keep the company running, to focus on profits, expansion, and brand reputation, not to get involved in personal matters. That was HR. That was management's job. And yet, he couldn't shake the feeling in his gut. He glanced at the time, 10:47 p.m. Her shift ended at 11:30 p.m. Without really thinking, he grabbed his coat, shut down his laptop, and headed toward the elevator. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, not really, but he knew one thing: tonight he was going to find out. Daniel pulled into the parking lot of the Horizon Diner on Peachtree Street, the company's first and busiest location. It wasn't often that he visited the stores in person anymore, not unless there was a high-profile meeting or a major issue that required corporate intervention. But tonight he wasn't here as a CEO. He wasn't here for a speech, a surprise inspection, or a press opportunity. He was here for something much simpler. He was here to see her. Through the glass storefront, the restaurant bustled with the last rush of late-night customers. Servers moved swiftly between tables, refilling drinks, clearing plates, taking orders. The open kitchen was a blur of movement, chefs flipping burgers, tossing fries into oil, plating dishes with practiced efficiency. It smelled like sizzling meat, fresh bread, melted cheese, and warm grease. A familiar scent, the scent of success, the scent of the business he had built from the ground up. But tonight it felt different. Tonight he wasn't looking at the business. He was looking at the people. And there she was. Aaliyah Brown. She moved like someone who had done this 1,000 times before, fluid, precise, fast. A black girl was carrying a tray of food, the stink of it at her temples. Her hair, thick and coiled, was tied back into a practical bun, but a few strands had escaped, sticking to her forehead from the heat of the stoves. She wore the standard black uniform, faded and slightly oversized, but, unlike the others, her sleeves were frayed at the edges, the fabric worn thin from too many washes. She didn't stop. Didn't slow down. While other employees chatted between orders, leaning on counters when they could, Aaliyah was always moving, wiping down surfaces, checking the grill, helping a younger cook who looked overwhelmed. She was everywhere at once, and yet somehow she was invisible. Daniel watched as a manager, one he vaguely recognized, approached her. He handed her a brown paper bag. She nodded her thanks, tucked it under her arm, and continued working. No hesitation, no excitement, just a quiet necessity. By the time the restaurant began closing for the night, Daniel had seen enough. He had seen her, and now he needed to talk to her. He waited near the entrance, watching as she untied her apron, folded it neatly, and grabbed a worn-out backpack from a hook in the kitchen. She adjusted the strap over her shoulder, nodded to the manager, and pushed open the heavy back door, stepping into the cool night air. Daniel followed. Aaliyah. She froze, turned. Her expression shifted instantly, from exhaustion to confusion to guarded professionalism. "Mr. Carter?" Her voice was steady, but her posture stiffened. I didn't know you were here." "I wasn't planning on stopping by," he admitted, taking a slow step forward. "But I saw your request earlier today." Her brows pulled together. "Request? The one about the leftovers?" Something flickered across her face. Embarrassment? Defensiveness? She quickly masked it, adjusting the strap on her backpack. "Oh, that." He nodded, waiting, letting the silence stretch. She didn't fill it. Daniel exhaled, shoving his hands into his pockets. "I was curious," he continued carefully, "because most employees don't go through formal channels for something like that. They just ask their manager. But you made it official." Aaliyah looked away, staring at the empty parking lot. "It's not a big deal." "It is if you had to ask in writing." Her jaw tightened. She looked like she wanted to say something, wanted to argue maybe, but instead she let out a soft sigh, glancing down at the bag in her hand. "I just don't like assuming things. Some places have rules about it, and I didn't want to get in trouble." Daniel studied her, his gaze unwavering. She was careful, too careful, like someone who had spent too much time making herself small, making herself unnoticed. He took a step closer. "Aaliyah, can I ask you something?" She hesitated, then gave a slow nod. "Can I see where you live?" Her head snapped up. "What?" "I don't mean to intrude," he clarified, his voice even, "but I'd like to understand why you felt the need to make that request, why it mattered enough for you to ask. And I think the best way to understand that is to see for myself." She stared at him like he had just spoken a different language. Her lips parted slightly, then closed. For the first time she looked nervous. "My place is," she swallowed, "it's small, kind of a mess. I don't think it's a great idea." Daniel didn't waver. "That doesn't matter to me." Aaliyah shifted, glancing back at the restaurant, at the empty street, anywhere but him. Her grip on the paper bag tightened. He could see the battle happening in her mind. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she let out a quiet breath. "Okay," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "If you really want to." Daniel nodded, stepping aside as she moved toward the bus stop. He followed, keeping his pace even with hers. He had come here expecting answers. What he didn't realize was that he was about to witness something that would change everything. The walk to the bus stop was quiet. Aaliyah didn't say much, and Daniel didn't push. She kept her head down, gripping the straps of her backpack, her movements careful, deliberate. The street was nearly empty, the occasional car passing by, headlights briefly illuminating the sidewalk. The cold night air carried a sharpness to it, the kind that seeped into your skin, that made you aware of how long you had been standing in it. As they reached the corner, Daniel glanced down the road. The bus stop was just ahead, a lone metal bench beneath a cracked schedule sign, its surface covered in old stickers and graffiti. The street was dimly lit, the nearest lamp flickering unsteadily. The bus itself was nowhere in sight. Daniel came to a stop. "I'll have my driver take you home." Aaliyah turned slightly, her brows furrowing. "What?" "I'll take you home," he repeated, nodding toward the black Cadillac Escalade parked across the lot, where his driver, Marcus, was already waiting behind the wheel. "It's late. It'll be faster." She hesitated. "That's really not necessary. I take the bus all the time." "I'm sure you do." His voice was calm, steady. "But you don't have to tonight." Ailey exhaled, glancing down the road again, as if willing the bus to appear. When it didn't, she shifted uncomfortably. She wasn't used to people offering things, not without expecting something in return. Finally, after a long pause, she gave a small nod. "Okay." Daniel led the way, opening the back door for her before stepping in beside her. The warmth of the car was an immediate contrast to the cold outside. The leather seats were soft, the scent of expensive cologne lingering in the air. Aaliyah sat stiffly, carefully setting the brown paper bag in her lap, gripping it as if it might disappear if she let go. Marcus glanced at Daniel through the rearview mirror. "Where to, sir?" Daniel looked at Aaliyah. She hesitated again, then murmured an address. It wasn't a part of the city he was familiar with. The car pulled smoothly onto the road. The quiet hum of the engine filled the space between them. Aaliyah kept her gaze fixed on the window, her fingers absently tracing the fold of the paper bag. Daniel could feel the tension in her posture, the kind that came from being in an unfamiliar space, from not knowing what to expect. "You don't have a car?" he asked finally, his tone light but curious. She shook her head. "Can't afford one right now." Daniel nodded, keeping his eyes on the passing streets. "How long does it take you to get home on the bus?" "About an hour, sometimes longer if I miss a transfer." Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. Another stretch of silence. Then, unexpectedly, Aaliyah let out a small, tired laugh, shaking her head. "This is weird," she muttered. Daniel glanced at her. "What is this?" She gestured vaguely between them. "I don't think I've ever had a CEO drive me home before." Daniel smirked slightly. "Technically my driver is driving you home." She chuckled, just barely. "Still weird." Marcus turned onto a quieter street, the buildings around them changing, becoming smaller, older. The main roads faded into more isolated ones, lined with houses that had seen better days. The occasional porch light flickered weakly, casting long, uneven shadows. Aaliyah shifted in her seat, seeming more tense as they got closer. "It's not much," she said suddenly, her voice quieter. "Where I live—" Daniel glanced at her. "That doesn't matter to me." She nodded, but there was something in her expression, something unsure, something guarded, as if she was preparing herself for judgment. A few minutes later she murmured, "Turn right up here." Marcus did, and then, as the car rolled to a stop, Daniel saw it. A trailer. Small, old, tucked behind a rusted fence with a broken latch, sitting between two other mobile homes that looked just as worn. The siding was dented in places, the roof patched where time had worn it thin. A single porch light flickered above the door. Daniel's hands tightened into fists against his lap. Aaliyah reached for the door handle quickly, as if wanting to get out before he could say anything. "Thanks for the ride," she said, already halfway out. But Daniel wasn't looking at her anymore. He was looking at where she was going, where she lived. He had expected a modest apartment, maybe an older house, something small but stable. Not this. She hesitated in the doorway, sensing his silence. Her expression was unreadable. "I told you," she murmured, "it's not much." And then, before he could say anything, she stepped inside. Through the open door, Daniel caught a glimpse of what was waiting for her inside. And what he saw made his stomach turn. Daniel sat in the back of the Escalade, his hands clasped together, his jaw tight as he stared through the windshield at the small trailer in front of him. The porch light flickered weakly, casting long, uneven shadows against the thin curtains covering the front window. The metal siding of the trailer was dented, patches of rust creeping along the edges. The air outside was still, heavy, the kind of silence that made everything feel colder than it was. Through the open door he caught a glimpse inside, just for a moment, just long enough to see them. 3 figures moved toward Aaliyah as she stepped inside. 2 children, Jamal, a lanky 14-year-old with tired eyes, and Zoe, barely 9, her hair in 2 messy braids, rushed forward, wrapping their arms around her waist. She let out a soft, exhausted laugh, pressing a kiss to the top of Zoe's head as she ruffled Jamal's curls. It was instinctual, practiced, like she had done this 100 times before, like this was the best part of her day. Behind them, an older woman, Deborah Brown, frail and slow-moving, her frame thin beneath a worn-out sweater, leaned against the arm of a tattered recliner. Her silver-streaked hair was pulled back loosely, her face drawn with exhaustion that ran deeper than sleep. Aaliyah barely had time to set the brown paper bag down before she moved toward her, hands reaching out automatically to steady her. Deborah gave her a small, grateful nod as she eased into the chair. Daniel exhaled sharply, leaning back against the headrest. Aaliyah didn't just have a family, she was holding it together. The door swung shut, the thin walls of the trailer barely muffling the sound of soft voices inside. Marcus shifted slightly in the driver's seat, glancing at Daniel through the rearview mirror, waiting for instruction, but Daniel didn't move. He wasn't sure how long he sat there, staring at that flickering porch light, his mind running through every image he had seen in the past 5 minutes. The old, threadbare couch, the too small table with mismatched chairs, the tiny kitchen with barely enough counter space to cook a meal. The way the children clung to Aaliyah as if she was the only thing keeping them grounded. And the way she pretended to eat so they wouldn't notice. He swallowed hard. She wasn't just skipping dinner tonight, this was a pattern. He had seen it in the way she moved her food around, making it look like she was eating when she wasn't. In the way she smiled at the kids, making sure they were full before she even considered taking a bite. In the way Jamal had asked, "Did you eat at work today?" As if it wasn't the first time, as if he already knew the answer. She was starving herself to make sure they didn't go hungry. Daniel clenched his fists. This wasn't just unfair. This was unacceptable. And the worst part? He had never noticed. He had spent years sitting in executive meetings, reviewing reports, approving payroll structures, signing off on policies designed to support employees. His company prided itself on being family-oriented, employee-focused, community-driven. That was the image they sold to the public, the branding they built their success on. And yet, here was one of his hardest-working employees, someone who had been with the company for 3 years, who had never once missed a shift, who worked double hours just to scrape by, living in a trailer, skipping meals, barely surviving. How many more employees were like her? How many had he failed without even realizing it? Marcus cleared his throat softly. Daniel inhaled slowly, steadying himself. His mind was already moving, calculating, restructuring. This wasn't just an oversight, this was a failure, and not just on a corporate level. He straightened, pulling out his phone. It rang twice before a groggy voice answered. "Sir? It's past midnight. Everything okay?" It was his head of operations, the same person responsible for overseeing the company's employee programs, for making sure people like Aaliyah didn't fall through the cracks. Daniel's voice was firm, unwavering. "No," he said. "Everything is not okay." There was a pause, a rustling sound like someone sitting up in bed. "What do you mean?" Daniel stared at the trailer one last time before turning his attention back to the road ahead. "We need to fix this," he said. All of it. He didn't wait for a response. He hung up. Because this wasn't a discussion, this was a decision. And he was just getting started. Daniel didn't go home that night. He couldn't. Instead, he sat in the back of his Escalade, staring out at the darkened trailer, his mind racing. The image of Aaliyah and her family was burned into his memory. The way the kids had clung to her, the way she had carefully divided the food, the way she had pretended to eat so they wouldn't worry. He had spent his entire career making decisions that shaped his company, building Horizon Diner into a multi-million-dollar success. But now, for the first time in years, he realized just how much he had missed. He glanced down at his phone, his recent call still sitting at the top of the screen. head of operations Charles Vaughn. Charles had tried calling back, twice. Daniel hadn't answered, not yet. He needed a plan first. Feeling bad wasn't enough. Knowing there was a problem wasn't enough. He had to do something. And he had to do it now. He turned his gaze back to the trailer. A small light still glowed inside, barely illuminating the thin curtains. He imagined Aaliyah inside, probably washing dishes, making sure her siblings had what they needed before settling down for the night. He imagined her mother, resting in that worn-out recliner, her body aching, her mind filled with worries. She didn't voice. Daniel exhaled sharply, tapping his fingers against the leather seat. "How long has she been working for us?" His voice broke the silence. Marcus, who had been sitting patiently in the driver's seat, adjusted the rearview mirror. "Aaliyah?" "Yes." Marcus thought for a moment. "A little over 3 years, I think. Always one of the best in the kitchen. Never calls out, never complains." "Never complains. Of course she doesn't." Daniel clenched his jaw. Employees like Aaliyah were the backbone of his company. The ones who showed up every day, put in the hours, didn't cause problems. And yet they were also the easiest to overlook. The ones who suffered in silence, because they didn't expect anyone to listen. That was going to change. He pulled up the company's internal payroll system on his phone, quickly navigating to Aaliyah's profile. His eyes scanned the numbers and his stomach tightened. Her salary wasn't minimum wage, but it wasn't far off. Even with overtime, she was barely making enough to stay afloat. How the hell had he let this happen? Daniel ran a hand over his face, forcing himself to think logically, one problem at a time, one solution at a time. Step 1, immediate action. He opened a new email and typed out a direct order to payroll. Effective immediately, Aaliyah Brown's salary is to be increased by 40%. Back pay adjustments to be calculated and issued within 48 hours. He hesitated, then added another line. Review all kitchen staff salaries across locations. I want a full report by the end of the week. Step 2. Food security. He had spent the last few hours watching one of his employees, struggle to feed her family while his restaurants threw out perfectly good meals at the end of every shift. That ended tonight. He pulled up another contact, Director of Operations. The phone barely rang once before a groggy voice answered. Daniel didn't waste time. Starting tomorrow, no more food waste. Every location will package leftover meals at the end of each shift. They'll be distributed to employees who need them. There was a pause. Then, cautiously, "Is this about that email earlier? The one from—" "Yes." Daniel's tone left no room for argument. "Make it happen." Another pause. Then a quiet, "Understood." Step 3. Emergency support. It wasn't just about food. It wasn't just about salaries. Aaliyah was caring for an entire family, including a sick mother, on a paycheck that barely covered rent. How many others in his company were in the same position? How many were one medical emergency away from losing everything? He scrolled through his contacts again, this time stopping at corporate HR. Another late-night call, another half-asleep voice answering. "I want a hardship assistance program set up," Daniel said, his voice calm but firm. "Emergency financial aid, medical support, rent relief if necessary." "Ah, sir, that's a pretty big—" "I know exactly how big it is," Daniel cut in. "I also know how much money we've spent on executive retreats this year. You'll find the budget." Silence. Then finally, a resigned sigh. "Yes, sir." Daniel ended the call and set his phone down, exhaling slowly. It wasn't enough, not yet, but it was a start. He looked back at the trailer one last time before finally speaking. "Take me home, Marcus." The car pulled away from the curb, but Daniel knew he wasn't leaving this problem behind. He was just getting started. The next morning, Daniel walked into the corporate office with one thing on his mind: change. The automatic glass doors slid open as he stepped inside, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floors. The receptionist greeted him with the usual, "Good morning, Mr. Carter," but he barely acknowledged it. He wasn't here for pleasantries. He wasn't here for routine. By the time he reached the executive conference room, most of his leadership team was already waiting. Some were still nursing cups of coffee, others flipping through their morning reports, completely unaware that their day was about to take a very different turn. Daniel didn't sit. He didn't waste time on small talk. He placed both hands on the table, his stance firm, his voice sharp as he spoke. "We have a problem." The room quieted instantly. Charles Vaughan, his head of operations, straightened in his chair, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. "Sir?" "About last night?" Daniel cut him off. "I don't want excuses. I don't want justifications. I want solutions, and I want them now." A murmur of uncertainty rippled across the table. The leadership team had seen Daniel angry before, frustrated, demanding. But this was different. There was an edge to his voice, something cold and unwavering, something that told them he wasn't going to leave this room until something changed. He turned his gaze to HR. "First order of business, employee wages. We're restructuring salaries, starting with the kitchen staff. A 40% increase across the board for those making below a livable wage. If we need to adjust the budget, we will. If it means cutting back on executive bonuses, so be it." Lisa Monroe, the VP of Human Resources, blinked in shock. "That's a major shift, Daniel. It's going to cost millions." "We made over $400 million in revenue last year," Daniel snapped. "Don't tell me we can't afford to pay our employees enough to live." Lisa closed her mouth. He didn't slow down, didn't let them catch their breath. "Second, we're implementing a company-wide food program. From now on, no edible food gets thrown away. All leftover meals will be packaged at the end of every shift and distributed to employees who need them. I want a logistics plan in place by the end of the day." Charles cleared his throat. "We'll need to coordinate that with store managers. Not every location has the same volume of waste." "Then figure it out." Daniel's voice was sharp. "Talk to managers, work with suppliers, make sure food goes where it's needed. If there are legal barriers, I'll handle them. Just get it done." Silence. Daniel turned to the last person in the room, Jacob Reynolds, head of finance. "And finally, we're establishing an emergency assistance fund for employees in crisis. Hardship grants, medical support, rent relief. No one who works for this company should have to choose between paying their bills and feeding their family." Jacob shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "That's a big undertaking. We'd have to vet applications, set up a review board, ensure we don't get taken advantage of." "I don't care if it's complicated," Daniel said flatly. "We have entire teams dedicated to managing company expenses. If we can track every dollar spent on marketing, we can track where our employees need help." Another beat of silence. No one argued, because they knew he was right. Daniel scanned the room, his eyes hard. "I don't care how much money we've made. I don't care how good our numbers look on paper. If our employees are living in trailers, skipping meals and struggling to survive while we sit here in leather chairs and drink our custom-roasted coffee, then we've failed." The weight of his words settled over them like a heavy fog. No one spoke. No one looked away. Because this wasn't just about one employee. This was about all of them. Daniel inhaled slowly, steadying himself. "You have 24 hours, he said, his voice low but firm. "I want action plans, budgets, and implementation strategies. If you need resources, ask. If you hit roadblocks, tell me. But this is happening, and if anyone in this room has a problem with that, there's the door." No one moved. No one left, because they knew. Daniel wasn't just talking, he wasn't just making a statement to ease his conscience. This was real, and it was only the beginning. By the end of the week, everything had changed. The salary increases were finalized, the food distribution program was implemented, the emergency assistance fund was set up, ready to provide immediate relief to employees who needed it. And Daniel? He didn't stop there. For the first time in years, he left his office and truly looked at the people working for him. He visited kitchens, talked to cooks, dishwashers, and servers, listened to their stories, their struggles, their realities. He no longer relied on reports and spreadsheets to tell him what was happening inside his company. He saw it for himself. And Aaliyah? She walked into work the following Monday, unaware of the storm she had unknowingly set into motion. But she knew something was different the moment her manager called her into the office, handing her an envelope. Inside was a letter, a raise, a bonus, enough to move out of the trailer, enough to breathe, enough to live. She stared at the paper, her hands trembling slightly. I don't understand, she murmured. Her manager simply smiled. It's from Daniel. She blinked. Mr. Carter? He said it was long overdue. Aaliyah stood there for a long time, staring at the words in front of her, as if waiting for them to disappear, as if waiting to wake up from a dream. But this was real. For the first time in a long time, she didn't have to pretend everything was okay. And Daniel? He didn't do it for recognition. He didn't make a press announcement or use it as a PR move. Because this wasn't about the company's image. It was about doing the right thing. He had spent years thinking success was measured in profits, expansion, and shareholder satisfaction. That night outside Aaliyah's trailer, he had learned a different truth.
Success wasn't just about building a company, it was about building people. And for the first time in his career, Daniel Carter didn't just feel like a CEO. He felt like a leader.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.